Today we are going to continue with trying to understand the biology of human behavior. And the most logical place to begin our study in detail is to study the single unit, which is the neuron. Now, the nervous system is composed of billions of nerve cells which carry information, which communicate with all the systems of the body. They regulate the body systems as well as our behavior. The nerve cells underlie all the activity and they form a very complex communication system. So, we will first look at the different types of neurons, then we will look at the structure of the neuron, and we will see how the message which is transmitted through the neuron to the other neurons in the different parts of the body are carried out. First it is an electrical impulse and then it is converted into a chemical impulse at the synapse, which is a gap between the two neurons which really do not touch each other. So, then we will also look at the nature of the chemical transmission which occurs across the synapse, which happens through substances known as neurotransmitters, and we will briefly look at why we need to study neurotransmitters and what effects they have on human behavior. So, let us start with understanding the three different types of neurons. There are sensory neurons. The first type of neurons are the sensory neurons, which carry messages through the sense organs to the brain or spinal cord. So, we receive all the information through our senses. Whatever information we receive about the world is through these senses, and these sensory neurons carry these messages to the brain and to the spinal cord. Then from there are different kinds of neurons which are known as motor neurons, which, as the name suggests, carries these messages away from here to the different parts of the body. So, we have the sensory neurons bringing in the information through the senses, and we have the motor neurons which carry these messages to the different parts of the body. Now, apart from these two types of neurons, we have the interneurons which connect one neuron to another. So, these interneurons, as the name again suggests, are the connecting neurons which connect maybe the motor and sensory neurons to carry out the intricate communication process. Okay? So, what are the three types? The sensory neurons, the motor neurons, and the interneurons. So, these are the three different types of neurons. Now, let us look at the structure of the neuron. Now, of course, the neuron is extremely small, microscopic, but we need to understand what is happening, what is it made up of, how it is structured, and what happens when the messages pass through the neuron. Now, you can think of the neuron as having three main parts. One is the cell body, which is known as the soma, and then we have the dendrites and the axons. If you look at the structure of a neuron, you could liken it to your palm. If you look at your palm, the center part could be the cell body, which is known as the soma. Now, this soma contains a nucleus, and from the soma are various branches like your fingers, okay, which are the dendrites. Now, these dendrites bring in the information from the different sensory organs. Once these dendrites bring in the information, they pass through the cell body and are carried away from the cell body by the third structure, which is known as the axon. So, we have the dendrites, we have the cell body, and we have the axon. These are the three main parts of the neuron. Now, the axon, the dendrites are of different shapes and sizes, all right, and they branch out in different ways, and they bring in the information. And the nucleus the soma is composed of a liquid, and outside the cell body also is liquid. And then we have the axons, which can be short or they can be very long, all right, and they are most of the axons in the human body are coated with a fatty substance which is known as a myelin sheath. Okay. And if you look at the diagram of the axon, you will see that the myelin sheath has gaps in between, which are known as the nodes of Ranvier. Now, when an impulse is transmitted from the dendrites through the cell body and carried away by the axon to the end of the axon, it is an electrical impulse. Now, at the end of every axon, there is a slight swelling, which is known as a terminal button, and then the electrical impulse runs down the axon. Now, if your axon has a myelin sheath, most of them have a myelin sheath, and the electrical impulse is much faster, and the impulse jumps from one node of Ranvier to another, and so it is a fast impulse. Now, axons which do not have the myelin sheath, the transmission of the electrical impulse is much slower. Okay. Now, so the impulse travels down the axon and reaches the end of the axon, which is the terminal button. Now, one neuron communicates with another neuron without touching each other. In between the two neurons is a very tiny space which is known as a synapse. Now, when the impulse reaches the terminal button, it causes the terminal buttons to release certain chemical substances which are known as neurotransmitters. And from this point onwards, the impulse becomes chemical in nature. So, that is why we say that the whole communication system is electrochemical in nature. The electrical impulse is converted into a chemical nature because the neurotransmitters are chemicals which carry the information. Now, these neurotransmitters are diffused to the receiving neuron, which again has dendrites, which will receive the information and again pass it to the cell body and again will travel through the axon. Now, some of these neurotransmitters absorbed by the receiving dendrites, and some of them are not, and they are diffused into the human body. All right. So, have you understood the structure of the neuron? So, the three main parts are the cell body, the dendrite and the axon. Okay. The dendrites carry in the information to the cell body, and the axon carries away the information to the adjoining neuron through the synapse, where the neurotransmitters are released and taken up or diffused into the human body. Okay. So, have you understood? So, we also have the myelin sheath and the nodes of Ranvier, which have implications for the speed of the transmission of information. Some of these neurons, of course, what sets it apart from other cells are the different shapes. Some of the neurons branch very much, some of them do not branch so much. So, neurons come in different shapes and sizes. How the information is transmitted through the neuron. Now, when the neuron is at rest, as we say, okay, it has a slightly negative charge within it. Within the cell body, there is a slightly negative charge, and the charge outside the cell is slightly positive. So, there is a difference in the charge within and outside the cell body. Now, the cell has a cell membrane which does not allow everything to come into the cell body. Now, when we receive information through the dendrites and the information has enough strength, the cell membrane becomes semi-permeable and allows certain of the ions, positively charged ions, to rush into the cell body. And from there, so when the neuron is at rest, when nothing is happening, when there are no messages which are being carried out, it is a very brief time, it is known as a resting potential. But when there is an impulse and the cell membrane becomes slightly permeable and there is a sudden rush of these ions, that is known as the action potential. And it is a very brief moment of time when the cell allows this information to come in. Then it is transmitted, as I told you, it jumps from node to node if it is myelinated, and along the length of the axon, and this whole action is electrical in nature. Now, the neural transmission follows an all or none law. That means, when a neuron is carrying the message, when it has an action potential, it is said to be firing, okay, like a gun which fires. So, it either fires or it does not. So, it is not that you can half fire it or something, it either fires or it is resting. All right. Now, also one more thing is that as the impulse travels down the axon, now some of the axons can be very long, okay, especially the ones which run down your leg. Now, we wonder if by traveling down the leg, will the intensity of the signal become less, but it does not. Okay. It maintains the same intensity whether it is traveling down a long axon or whether it is traveling down a short axon. So, it fires or it does not fire. So, it is either resting or for a brief moment it is firing. Now, it can vary, the strength of the communication can vary. If it receives a lot of information from a lot of dendrites, then the strength of the communication will be stronger or weaker. Okay? It depends on that, not on the actual electrical impulse which travels at the same strength down the axon. So, is that clear now? Okay? Now, what happens to it when it reaches the end of the axon? As I told you, it makes the terminal button release. There are sacs over there which contain chemical substances called neurotransmitters, and these are released when the impulse comes to the end of the axon, and the neurotransmitters, as I told you, are inhibitory or they are excitatory. So, if they stimulate, if they are excitatory, they are taken up by the next receiving neuron, or else if they are inhibitory, they are diffused into the human body. Now, as I said, all the neurotransmitters which are released are not taken up by the surrounding neurons. So, for communication to occur between one neuron and another, the electrical impulse has to be converted into a chemical, has to be chemical in nature. Now, as I told you, neurons do not touch each other, yet they manage to communicate. When people communicate, what do they use? Words. And when neurons communicate, they use chemicals. Okay? So, that is what happens, and these chemicals, these neurotransmitters influence our behavior in myriad ways. We will look at some of the neurotransmitters and what implications they have for different aspects of behavior. Now, more than 50 types of neurotransmitters have been identified, each one of them with a unique chemical makeup. But we will just briefly look at about 5 or 6 of these neurotransmitters which really have implications for human behavior. Some of these neurotransmitters are implicated in disorders such as Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, some of them in mood states such as anxiety and depression, and some even in aggression. Do you know the names of any neurotransmitters? Have you ever heard of any names? No? So, just make a little note of the different types of neurotransmitters which we will be looking at briefly today. Acetylcholine, GABA, norepinephrine, dopamine, serotonin, and endorphins. Of course, there are many more, but we will just see what are the effects of these neurotransmitters which are released into the human. Now, as I told you, some of them are excitatory and some of them are inhibitory. That means they inhibit behavior or they stimulate behavior. Now, acetylcholine is an excitatory neurotransmitter and is involved in the action of muscles. It is also involved in learning and memory. Because it is involved in the action of muscles, we find that this neurotransmitter is implicated in the disorder known as Alzheimer's. You must have heard of that. Do you know what are some of the things which happen in Alzheimer's disease? We have a loss of memory, which is what is most commonly thought, but there are other changes also which occur. Okay. And one of the neurotransmitters implicated is acetylcholine. Now, norepinephrine is an inhibitory neurotransmitter. It controls alertness. It is involved in emotional arousal, eating, wakefulness, memory, and learning. So, you can see the influence on a wide range of human behavior. Low levels of norepinephrine are indicated in depression, and if you have too much of it, it could be that you are in a manic state. This hormone is often released during times of stress. The next neurotransmitter is dopamine, which is again an inhibitory neurotransmitter. Some neurotransmitters can be at different times they can be excitatory and different times they can be inhibitory. This controls voluntary movement, and therefore, low levels of this is implicated in Parkinson's disease, which is characterized by extreme tremors where your hands shake and your limbs shake, and this is because of low levels of dopamine. High levels of dopamine are also indicated in another psychotic disorder, schizophrenia. Dopamine controls, as I said, voluntary movement. It affects sleep, mood, alertness, excessive fatigue, and sometimes increased motor activity. Serotonin, which is associated very much with sleep, is another neurotransmitter which is inhibitory in nature. It regulates sleep, mood, attention, and learning. In patients who suffer from depression, we often find low levels of this neurotransmitter. And people who suffer from depression are therefore often given a medicine known as Prozac, which increases levels of serotonin and helps to lift the depressed mood. Endorphins are excitatory neurotransmitters and they shield the body from pain, elevate the feelings of pleasure. So, it is a feel good neurotransmitter, and these neurotransmitters are present in people as varied as a woman who is giving birth, who is experiencing a tremendous amount of pain, or the elevated feelings of pleasure of a long distance runner, okay, or a person in shock, maybe after an accident or a traumatic incident. All of them have high levels of these endorphins, which both protect us from pain as well as elevate the feelings of pleasure. So, we can see from here, from the study of these neurotransmitters, they definitely in abnormal behavior such as Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, depression, anxiety, these neurotransmitters are implicated. But apart from that, in our normal states of behavior such as alertness, learning, memory, sleep also is controlled and regulated by these neurotransmitters. So, they play a very important role in influencing our behavior. Okay, to sum up, just to sum up what we have looked at today, we looked at the basic unit of the nervous system, which is the neuron. Okay? And it is these billions of neurons which make up the nervous system and which make possible the intricate communication which occurs very fast and without even our realizing it between the different parts of the body which are involved in behavior. Okay? So, I told you that there are 3 different types of neurons, and we looked at the structure of the neuron with the different parts, and then we looked at how the electrical impulse which comes through the neuron, the different parts of the neuron, is converted into a chemical signal at the end of the axon, and how it has to be turned into a chemical impulse before it can communicate with another neuron. Okay? And they communicate without touching each other, because it is made possible because of the release of these neurotransmitters, which are chemicals. Now, these neurotransmitters are very, very important, and science today is trying to discover what is it, the lack of or the low levels of which neurotransmitters and the high levels of which neurotransmitters cause problems which are of great concern to people today. There are many diseases which are degenerative in nature, which occur in old people. That means, the neural cells no longer have the capacity to regenerate. We lose cells in the body all the time because of what we are doing, but the body has the capacity to repair and to generate new cells. Now, this capacity is lost as you become older, and that is why we call these disorders such as Alzheimer's or Parkinson's as degenerative disorders. Okay? And mostly they occur in old age, and if you look at Alzheimer's, it is because of a particular level of a neurotransmitter, okay, which is implicated in learning and memory. And that is why you will find one of the characteristics of Alzheimer's disease is that people lose some parts of their memory. That is what is most visible. Okay. Now, if you look at Parkinson's disorder also, which is characterized by tremors, it is because of a hormone which controls movement, and so low levels of it can cause Parkinson's. Now, in schizophrenia also, there is a break from reality, and this also is because of a high level of certain neurotransmitters. So, science is trying to identify the neurotransmitters and the different levels of these neurotransmitters which are implicated in these disorders, and of course, we are able to give certain synthetic neurotransmitters which mimic the real neurotransmitters, which can help people to overcome some of the symptoms of these disorders. All right. So, neurotransmitters play a very important role in determining our memory, our learning, our moods, okay, and all the various aspects of human behavior. So, it is at the cutting edge of research today, the research which is being done on neurotransmitters and its effects. So, we have looked at the basic unit, which is the neuron, and how it carries out throughout the body. The nervous system is made up of all these billions of neurons, how it carries out these complicated functions. So, is that clear for you now? Are there any questions which you would like to ask?
Yes, ma'am. I have a question.
Yes.
Is the neuron of the newborn different from an older person?
Okay, that's a good question. Neurons have the capacity to change, and this plasticity remains throughout the life of a human being, and the fibers have the capacity to increase or decrease as a function of age, environment experience as well as chemical changes. So, neurons, a neuron of a baby will be different from that of an older person. Now, an older person will have more experience, okay, will have had different experiences and will be older, and neurons continue to change their shape and structure as well as regenerate, and therefore, it will be different between the newborn and the old person.